Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, tensions between the US and Iran have historically been pretty high, but since the US pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, that is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, citing Iran for violating the terms of the deal, the situation has been exceptionally bad. But now tensions have turned into threats, especially considering the events of the past 48 hours. It started off in recent weeks, we saw US turning up the heat on Iran in its attempt to crush Iranian exports to zero by actually increasing further sanctions and also refusing waivers to countries earlier allowed to import Iranian oil. It followed with the US designated Iran's elite revolutionary guards a terrorist organization, and then more recently began military preparations to deter Iran. So in these past 48 hours, the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, announced the repositioning of a carrier strike group and redeploying strategic bombers to the Middle East in response to some nebulous threat from Iran. No clarity on what exactly the threat from Iran was given. Then the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, cancelled an important trip to Germany at the last minute on Tuesday for a fleeting 4-hour visit to Iraq, where he told Iraqi officials he didn't want anyone else interfering in their country, also expressing concern over US troops posted there. On Tuesday, US Central Command spokesperson Captain Bill Urban said they had seen indications that Iranian proxy forces were making preparations to possibly attack US forces in the region. Now, what exactly is the threat all of a sudden from Iran, and where is the region headed with these latest developments? We will be talking more about where this is headed and what our panel guests are making of it. We are joined by Mr. Matthew Bryza. He is a former US diplomat who is currently based in Istanbul. Also, we have with us Mr. Hamidreza Gholamzadeh, a foreign policy expert who is joining us from Tehran, and Mr. Kourosh Ziabari, a journalist who is also joining us from Iran. I want to start with you, Mr. Matthew, especially about this statement that came from the White House that John Bolton essentially read out and said that there was credible information that Iran was threatening US forces or US assets in the region. Do you have any information or what this credible information or evidence is, and where is it coming from?
No, I don't have any specific information. I mean, I'm no longer affiliated with the U.S. government, but I do recall that within the last week or so, there were some statements coming out of the Iranian government saying that it reserved the right in response to U.S. sanctions and pressure on Iran not to be able to sell its oil globally, and the waiver or the ending of those waivers to certain countries, that Iran reserved the right to cut the flow of oil through the Straits of Hormuz if the United States is going to cut the flow of Iranian oil. So I think that maybe this belligerent rhetoric coming out of Washington now, as well as the announcement of the repositioning of the USS Abraham Lincoln, is part of a way to respond to what somebody, I guess the Central Command, believes is a credible threat. I would like to add, if I can, too, that there's a lot of speculation in Washington that John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, is a real hawk on Iran and may even favor there being a military confrontation between the U.S. and Iran.
That's essentially with his history in how he led U.S. into the Iraq War, right?
Well, John Bolton wasn't such a leader in the Iraq War. I mean, he was part of the Bush administration, but he is part of that trend in U.S. foreign policy that is ready to use force in the Middle East. So, yeah, he comes from that ideological family, yeah. Now, interestingly, I'm not one to defend President Trump pretty much ever, but he is on record saying things that are quite different from this Bolton approach. For example, a few months ago, he said he looks forward to meeting President Rouhani. He said he thinks he's a lovely man. And there's a report in the Washington Post saying that he's tried 8 times to meet with President Rouhani, even appealed to French President Macron to try to set up a meeting, but was rebuffed every time. So there may be some confusion within the White House right now about this Iran policy.
Let's ask Mr. Hamidreza what his take on this is. Mr. Hamidreza, would you see it as President Trump having offered a fig leaf or an approach to President Rouhani to come to the negotiating table in the past?
I don't see actually a negotiation at site. But there is a point, as Matthew was almost saying, that there are two different points of view in U.S. foreign policy right now, as we can understand. The first one is believing in maximum pressure on Iran, trying to use sanctions or measures that the United States has against Iran to try to have either regime change or change of behavior, whatever they call it. The second approach is the one led by John Bolton. Mr. Bolton is, as Matthew again said, is a hawkish person and is a warmonger. He's trying to actually incite a war against Iran, and he seems to be dissatisfied with any other results less than a war, a military war against Iran. So it seems that the statement that he made on a couple of days ago about the U.S. Navy, Abraham Lincoln, and the approaches that he has, all of them are trying to actually sell his war rhetoric to the President Trump administration. Let's just remember that this Lincoln Navy, which he mentioned in the statement, was scheduled to leave for Middle East, for the Persian Gulf, a month ago, and he left the United States actually early April. So then he was actually, the way it went was actually the pre-scheduled agenda.
So he's just taking advantage of the opportunity and trumping up the event that's already taking place. But let me, interrupt you here and read out, I think it would be apt, John Bolton's statement that he gave on May 5th. And he said, in response to a number of troubling and escalatory indications and warnings, the United States is deploying the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group and a bomber task force to the U.S. Central Command region to send a clear and unmistakable message to the Iranian regime that any attack on United States interests or on those of our allies will be met with unrelenting force. This was a statement he gave on May 5th, which is essentially the past 48 hours escalations have going through the roof. Now, there are several media reports that are coming through, claims that this intelligence that is claiming that he has was actually from the Israel's Mossad agency that was given 2 weeks ago to a U.S. team headed by Bolton, and that this was at least part of the reason for the warning and the move to deploy the aircraft carrier. Mr. Hamidreza, do you think this information that was allegedly passed to the U.S. Could be possibly true? Because if it is, then there is a real problem here.
Actually, there doesn't seem to be any movement by the Iranian side. And we know that Iran has never begun a war against anyone. So Iran doesn't have any benefit actually in inciting a war against American entities or forces, whatsoever it is in the region. So Iran is not after war, and there is not any movement as far as we know here in Iran. Maybe Netanyahu and his team have some more information more than the Iranians here. I don't know. We have heard a lot of noise and stories from him. It would not be a surprise if he has actually sold another story to Mr. Bolton.
Okay, let me get a take on it. Mr. Ziabari, what do you make of this statement from Bolton, especially considering that there has been no clarity on what kind of intelligence the U.S. has about Iran possibly looking to attack U.S. allies or its own assets in the region?
Yes, actually, it's very unfortunate that the recent showdown between Iran and the United States is increasing the likelihood of a possible military confrontation in the region. I'm very concerned that the achievements that were made under President Obama during his 8 years in office are being undone because actually just today Iran announced that it will start stopping to carry out certain commitments under the JCPOA, which was a landmark achievement within Iran and the international community. The statement by John Bolton is also concerning in terms of showing the level of hostility and indicating the level of acrimony between Iran and the United States. It all started when President Trump pulled out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action unilaterally and trampled the Resolution 2231 of the United Nations Security Council. I think that the Iran nuclear deal was a very strong, very reliable agreement that should have been preserved. And the withdrawal of the United States from this agreement basically destroyed the fruit of diplomacy, commitment, engagement between Iran and the six world powers. And even though Iran and the United States did not have a very friendly and amicable relations following the Iranian Revolution in 1979, after all, the nuclear deal was one of the most
it was a milestone event. It was a very big development. And Mr. Matthew, something that Mr. Ziabari really aptly highlights here, the Article 26 and the Article 36 of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, basically authorize any member of this deal to not implement partly or completely their commitments if any one of the members of the party to this JCPOA do not comply. So technically, when U.S. withdraws over allegations that Iran is not giving its all and is violating the nuclear deal without even having the evidence to back it, when there is actually evidence there that Iran is, for the first time, complying to denuclearizing, then it's pretty much left the game open for anybody to withdraw from this, don't you think?
I definitely think so. And, all of our viewers should remember that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN body, has actually concluded that Iran does remain in compliance. So that gets to the big news of today, I think, about this issue, which is that now President Rouhani has tweeted that Iran is going to, citing, by the way, these articles in the JCPOA, is going to slow down its compliance, not break with the agreement, but slow down its compliance in terms of exporting heavy water and lowly enriched uranium, with the possibility or the threat that in 60 days, if the European participants, as well as China and Russia, don't deliver the economic benefits to Iran promised by this agreement, then Iran will take more significant action that could then constitute a withdrawal. So yes, what you said has already happened. Iran has reacted, but still in accordance with that agreement, using those exact articles.
Yeah. Right. And so, Mr. Reza, the situation, it seems, is almost going against what U.S. had hoped to establish with Iran, to make it allegedly back down from its interference in Gulf countries there with its allies. Now, U.S. intelligence has shown that Iran has moved short-range ballistic missiles aboard boats in the Persian Gulf. And it's cited this as a critical reason for U.S. to ramp up its aggressive moves also. What is U.S.'s perception of threat from Iran? Why would Iran take on the U.S. under this immense pressure it's already in?
Let's be frank, the United States can be satisfied only with destroying Iran and the regime change, something that they try not to mention in Iran. And the main barrier against them, ahead of them, is the missile program of Iran, which has made Iran a regional power, actually. And we have seen several examples of the power Iran has had in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, and even in Afghanistan. When the United States attacked Afghanistan in 2001, the one who actually saved them and helped them in making progress in Afghanistan was Iran, helping them against the terrorist group there in Afghanistan. So the United States has experienced firsthand what the power Iran has. The United States has been defeated in Syria and also in Iraq, in Yemen, even as a proxy war. So the United States knows that, Washington knows that the missile program, the military power of Iran is not something that can be easily defeated. So the whole thing that they are doing is trying to force Iran into putting the missile program aside, or to just surrender to whatever the United States wants. And that's something that is not going to happen.
So this is also, analysts are saying, Mr. Ziabari, that this was a planned deployment that the U.S. was carrying out, and it's just been repackaged to put Iran further on notice, to put more pressure on Iran. Do you think that if this is the possibility, then what exactly is U.S. hoping to achieve here?
Right, yes. Actually, it's quite clear that the Trump administration is using all of its resources to ramp up pressure on Iran. I don't remember of any U.S. administration investing so much on actually increasing economic, military, political pressure on Iran. The most unprecedented sanctions on Iran have been imposed under President Trump and his administration. Unfortunately, this is simply complicating the relationship between the two countries, complicating the livelihoods of ordinary Iranian citizens. I fear that this is going to kill the chances of rapprochement and detente between the two countries in the future, because after all, this is not a viable situation. Iran and the United States need to sit at the negotiating table and solve their differences with each other after 4 decades of hostility and conflict. And I think, after all, the Trump administration and President Trump himself is taking advice from the wrong people. John Bolton, when he was out of office, actually advocated for regime change in Iran fiercely and openly. And he has been delivering talks at rallies and demonstrations held by the
right. There are two possibilities here, isn't there? That they're either doing this for a regime change or they want Iran to really back off from the Middle East, where it is involved in proxy wars. I mean, there are two main theories going around, but the fallout, as we are seeing, as some fear, is a full-out war between the two. But is that a reasonable fear to have, considering the Iraq war cost $1.1 trillion to the United States Department of Defense, according to the United States Department of Defense?
Right. After all, there are some scholars and some political scientists who believe that the pressures being exerted on Iran are aimed at regime change. And even though the Trump administration officials have ruled out this possibility and said that they are simply trying to change the behavior of the regime, I think they will be very much happy to see a change of the government in Tehran. After all, the sanctions, the designation of IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, and the fact the Trump administration has sent ambassadors and politicians across the world to persuade different countries to stop doing trade with Iran means that they have mobilized all of the resources to bring Iran to its knees, whether it's in the form of regime change or whether it's a weakening of the government. It's quite clear that the intention of the Trump administration is to see a weaker Iran with limited influence in the region. Even though I'm not the spokesperson of the Iranian government, but I can say with absolute certainty that neither the policies of the Trump administration nor the response by the Iranian government in this regard are helpful to regional peace and stability. Mm-hmm. And it's understandable that with these tensions being mounted every day, the region is going to, and also the global oil market, right. This is going to increase the oil prices to unprecedented levels, as we have seen recently. Iran is a major oil exporter and a member state of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And the fact that the U.S. is doing its best to drive Iran's oil exports to zero is also means that we should expect more unfortunate and more sad days for the global oil market and energy market as well.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you there, but very quickly, we're running out of time here. Mr. Hamidreza, in your opinion, is President Trump hoping to compel Iran to negotiate a new deal, or is it just interested in a regime change in Iran?
There's not going to be any negotiation between Iran and the United States because President Trump has proved to be an irrational actor and something we cannot trust any commitments that his country would make. In that regard, there is going to be no negotiation. And the end of the procedure that we are going, the path that he is taking, I don't know if he is going to be trusting Mr. Bolton. That might lead to a war, which will be a disastrous war against not only Iran and the United States, but the whole region, a strategic region of the Middle East. Otherwise, he would try to put pressure on Iran and just trying to use a rhetoric which is trying to say that I have won against Iran, I have put pressure on Iran, I have control and changed the behavior of Iran, all the things that he has claimed so far. And there would be no change in behavior of Iran.
The trajectory so far doesn't look good, because what we're seeing as a result of Trump's move is that Iran is toughening up its stance. It's not really accommodating. It doesn't seem like it. But very quickly, last comment from you, Mr. Ziabari. Do you think when U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, that Iran could have done better in terms of availing that opportunity?
Well, I think Iran's behavior has so far, in terms of actually complying with its commitments under the JCPOA, has been reasonable and wise. Even though today, as the other guest mentioned, Iran has indicated that it is going to slow down some of its commitments under the JCPOA. But, well, I believe that Iran has done its best to demonstrate to the international community that at least in the nuclear issue, it has some goodwill, and it wants to actually benefit from being part of this agreement. But the unilateral withdrawal of the United States, it's reneging on the resolution.
Right, no, that it is, definitely. But fortunately, we've run out of time here. Thank you so much, Mr. Hamidreza and Mr. Ziabari, for your time and your insight here. We're going to take a quick short break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. Now, we've discussed in the first part of this show what is happening between U.S. and Iran as tensions escalate in the Middle East. And let's not forget, at the base of all of this largely is, but not exhaustively, the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So keeping that in mind, let's shed some light on how just last weekend North Korea tested a missile and how the U.S. reacted to that. So on Friday, Pyongyang tested a ballistic missile for the first time in over a year. It significantly undercut what President Donald Trump had been saying was his biggest accomplishment or achievement in talks with North Korea that had been going on for months on end, which were about the end of testing weapons. Now, it was, though, a short-range missile that couldn't reach the United States, of course, but it shows that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's patience might be running out, as the last meeting between the two leaders was without a deal. Trump has reacted to Kim Jong-un's move by saying that he still remains hopeful that Kim will choose to dismantle his nuclear arsenal. And he's also said he also knows that I am with him. Now, that's a far cry from what President Trump had been saying just a few years ago about North Korea threatening to rain down fire and fury and totally destroying the country. Let me just remind you, back in October 2017, when U.S. hadn't ruled out the use of force to push Pyongyang to halt missile and nuclear tests, President Trump, without clarifying, of course, famously said that 25 years of negotiation with North Koreans have always failed, and that now only one thing will work. Again, let's not forget that President Trump's debut speech at the United Nations General Assembly in September 2017, where he threatened to totally destroy North Korea if it threatened the U.S. or any of its allies. And he also derided Kim Jong-un as the rocket man, to which Kim famously retorted, calling Trump a mentally damaged dotard. Now, cut to 2019, and the scene has drastically changed, especially in context to how U.S. treats other countries who are violating terms and conditions when it comes to the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So let's talk to our panel of experts, how they interpret what's happening between the U.S. and North Korea and what it could mean for the region. We have with us, continuing from the earlier segment, the former U.S. diplomat, Mr. Matthew Bryza, who is speaking to us from Istanbul. Thank you for staying on. And also we have Mr. Carlyle Thayer, an expert on international affairs and also an emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. Let me quickly come to you, Mr. Matthew. I want to ask you specifically about Kim Jong-un's move. What do you think he was thinking when he tested this missile? Of course, he knew the risks.
Oh, certainly he knows the risks, and he has proven to be very careful in responding to President Trump, notwithstanding that remark about President Trump being a dotard. So I think what Kim Jong-un is doing is signaling that he's unhappy. He's unhappy that the last meeting he had with President Trump in Hanoi failed to achieve anything. In fact, You could argue President Trump humiliated Kim by simply walking out even before they sat down to lunch. And so I think he's showing that he's impatient. And it's not entirely different than what's just happened in Iran, where the Iranian government maybe made a threat to close down the Straits of Hormuz and is now trading threats with the United States. So I think he fired not a long-range ballistic missile. It was a short-range missile. Probably ballistic, people are saying, but that's not even clear. And what President Trump has said, the benchmark for him is that since November 2017, North Korea has not tested any long-range ballistic missiles. So Kim sent a message below the threshold that has been set by President Trump as meriting a strong U.S. response.
All right. And Mr. Carl, what take on this? What do you think Kim was expecting to get? And also shed some light on how President Trump reacted.
Well, one, he's getting attention. That's what he wants. Trump can walk away from a deal and leave it to Secretary Pompeo and others to try to reignite the discussions between them. But firing a ballistic missile like his earlier directed tests gets Washington's attention and gets it quickly. What's changed in your list from the dotard? Remember, Trump said he fell in love with Kim. He's had two summit meetings with him, and his latest tweet put a great deal of store, as Trump does, in personal relations with Putin, with Xi Jinping, and now with Kim Jong-un, that he really feels he can go. Now, Kim has set an informal deadline by the end of this year where he might change from diplomacy to other means if talks don't resume. But Trump and Pompeo have been rather upbeat. Pompeo revealed that there have been recent contacts, and he seems positive about it. Mm-hmm. And also that Kim has come back from that summit with Moscow, and I think he's getting support from both China and Russia that it has to be a step-by-step process, not a big deal that Trump wanted, and that would suit Kim Jong-un.
So he seems to be getting a lot of support from in China, and that could be possibly a reason behind showing this sort of show of power, or almost like going against the rules here for President Trump. I mean, this is obviously not helping the situation, the relationship that it's had with the U.S. Is it because it's not really eager to go back on the negotiating table?
Well, there are some analysts have said that by firing a short-range missile that Kim is playing on differences between Japan and the United States. A short-range ballistic missile has 1,000-kilometer range, and that puts Japan in the target, if you will, the west coast of Japan. And then it creates problems between Japan and the United States with the Abe-Trump talks recently. Again, where else can Kim go? He's hurting from the sanctions. Mm-hmm. He's hurting economically, and that's a separate issue that the UN has just reported on. Mm-hmm. He needs a movement, and a lot of analysis was he expected movement from Trump in Hanoi, and that didn't occur. Mm-hmm. And so he's gone back. Things have dragged on. Other issues have come up to attract Trump's attention. Firing this missile, like subsequent earlier tests of other weapon systems, anti-weapon armor, I think was one of them, is just, it grabs attention. If you monitor American TV or read the newsletters from the think tanks, it's just every time this happens, a tsunami of reports come out focusing on how to get the deal.
Right, so, and also, Kim, do you think it could possibly be that the U.S. and South Korea, it was essentially South Korea that came out with this report that these missiles had been launched, and then it kind of downgraded the announcement saying, oh, they were just some deployment, sort of trying to take away that it wasn't a missile. However, the U.S. and South Korea, they have been performing joint military drills in the region also, and Pyongyang has always seen these as a thinly veiled threat. Do you think this was also indicative of how Kim Jong-un, feels about this collaboration in these military drills there?
Well, I think there are four explanations of what we're talking about. We've discussed two of them. One, to get attention from the U.S. to drive a wedge with the Japan alliance. The third explanation that I've heard is because of the low-level military drills. He still wanted to make the point. And the fourth was that the Americans have tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, and Trump, that Kim is reacting to that. I think there might be plausibility in the first two, less so on the third. Kim's being unpredictable, but this ballistic missile also was accompanied by multiple launch rocket systems of 250 mils and 300 mils, so that it's just a very tactical weapon system. So the fact that the U.S. is not being threatened, it's not an ICBM, it's not nuclear capable, falls below the threshold that Trump is concerned about. He's keeping America safe, and he believes he can get denuclearization in exchange for a bright economic future for Korea. That's his transactionalism. That's pie in the sky as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So, Mr. Matthew, let me come to you here. Would it be too naive to draw a parallel here on how U.S. is dealing with the sort of denuclearization or the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, how it's dealing with Iran on this, and then on the other hand, we see how patient and understanding it seems to be with North Korea. What could be so starkly different? What could be more different than how it's treating both countries?
Sure. Well, first of all, looking for consistency in U.S. foreign policy, as somebody who spent 23 years in the Foreign Service, 4 at the White House, by the way, is risky because the U.S. foreign policy often isn't so coordinated between regions. And that's all the more the case in the Trump administration, where the normal policy coordination mechanisms are no longer convening at senior levels. But there's a second reason besides a lack of policy coordination, and that is President Trump's approach to North Korea in terms of himself personally saying, I am the great leader. I put pressure on North Korea. I threatened them with war, as you may recall, and I forced them to the negotiating table, and I'm going to get a deal. So he's totally exposed right now, having exercised all of the art of the deal, as the name of his book is. You threaten, you push, then you negotiate, you flatter, and then you show some patience, and you go back to threats again if you need to. So that's what he's decided is his approach to North Korea based on who he is. When it comes to Iran, you have to go back to the presidential campaign. And you'll recall that one of his key points to differentiate himself from candidate Hillary Clinton was that she supported the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, and he believed it was fatally flawed. So all along, from before he was president, he wanted to destroy that agreement. And then also, because his foreign policy now in the Middle East is based upon close alliance with Israel, confronting Iran anywhere is an important part of his approach.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Matthew, for your wonderful insight and staying throughout this. But let me come back to Mr. Carl. It seems hard to believe that United States could be leading these talks to try and make North Korea compromise or heed to some concessions, considering that it's one of the 5 nuclear weapon states where they declared nuclear arsenal under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, of which it was actually one of the original drafters. And also that in good faith, it's supposed to sort of de-escalate the stockpile that it has or bring down the numbers that it has on its nuclear arsenal front. So going forward with North Korea, and then also last week it did fire an ICBM. And could that also be one of the reasons why it is not succeeding? President Trump is not succeeding in getting various countries to agree on denuclearization.
Well, I think there's widespread agreement. I mean, there is a large overlap of agreement between Russia, China, and the United States about not having war or conflict break out on the Korean Peninsula and having a process of denuclearization, whether immediately or more likely staged, occur. I think that's very important. I correct you, there was not an intercontinental ballistic missile that was fired. It was a short-range ballistic, probably Iskander solid fuel, which is even more difficult to launch in an emergency time.
By the U.S.
Oh, by the U.S., yes. But the U.S. has pulled out of as Matthew was saying, if we try to link regions of the world, we're finding contradictions all over the place. My point would be, yes, America's against nuclear proliferation. Trump did what he did, and as long as Kim holds to his personal promise that he pro-offered not to fire or test long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles and not conduct any further nuclear tests, then Trump is satisfied. But we know already that from the Hanoi summit that they're proceeding to process fissile material. They're still developing rocket engines. They're doing other things that need to be addressed. So the imminent issue has gone. The big show for Trump, the sound and fury, Little Rocket Man, all that gained him publicity. It's now shifted to, I can bring peace to he sometimes dismisses reporters' questions, but I'm too busy bringing peace to the world. It's a work in progress, and it's hanging there. But he's open to a third summit. And this is just unprecedented. How many times do you meet with Kim and not get a deal? And that's exposing the president.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Al, for giving us your time and your insight here. I'd like to welcome another guest who's joining us, Mr. Fabian Kretschmer, a Korean correspondent. And also, he is joining us from Seoul right now. What is your insight into how this has developed with North Korea launching these short-range missiles and how Trump has reacted? Are you surprised by President Trump's reaction?
Well, I'm not really surprised by his reaction, but we have to see his reaction to the public might be different than what he stated towards his confidence. We know that he reacted quite angry at first. We know that from reports within the White House. And but to the public, he basically states his goodwill, his commitment to continue those denuclearization talks. But I think there was a huge plot point, turning point with the Hanoi summit when leader Kim Jong-un and US President Trump met and they failed to reach an agreement, and everybody was really eagerly waiting for a breakthrough in the denuclearization talks. And we, on the other hand, we realized how big the discrepancy between those two positions are of the two countries. And I think the North Korea, they did not break their moratorium, their testing moratorium, because it was only a short-range missile, which can reach, for example, Seoul, where I'm based right now. But it's not a threat to the United States, but it's definitely a strong signal. And I think the door for future negotiations keeps closing. So I think it's really a critical point right now at this moment.
Right. And also we are now joined by Mr. Bruce Harris. He is a Seoul-based journalist also, but is currently in New Delhi. Mr. Bruce, we're just talking about the Hanoi summit, and essentially I want to ask you what, in your opinion, were the key factors that made it a failure between U.S. and Kim Jong-un coming to an agreement?
Well, Ayza, it would seem that at least the United States perhaps didn't have quite an understanding of what North Korea was going to bring to the table. Well, let me rephrase that. It seems both sides didn't comprehend what the other's position was at that time. I think we can blame both sides perhaps for having a flawed notion about what kind of promises were going to be made in Hanoi. From the American side, I think President Trump and his administration expected North Korea was willing to meet in the middle, if I can use that term, as far as sanctions relief and what North Korea would give up in return. North Korea, on the other hand, came with, it seems like, a pretty firm line. They wanted an extensive amount of sanctions relief. It's not clear exactly to what extent, but the U.S. was not willing to budge on that at all. And ultimately, it had a stalemate. I think a lot of that's going to be kept private for a long time if we ever learn exactly what happened in that negotiating room. Firm factors, yes. I think not both sides misinterpreted perhaps what the other was willing to do as far as bending to reach some sort of an agreement. I think they both presented much firmer, hard positions than either side expected.
Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to highlight here, was that it seemed almost that there was so much inflexibility from both sides. Now, North Korea, of course, is under a huge economic crunch in itself. I mean, they're like 40% of the population is suffering massively in poverty and shortage of food. In fact, President Trump recently had given his sort of support to South Korea sending food aid. Now, Mr. Fabian, where I'm going with this is that having been that situation, that inflexibility caused a failure of something that would have been a remarkable milestone for both of those countries. Do you think that with this situation developing as it is, there might be a change in stance from the U.S. now?
Well, I think the U.S. will be flexible in the end. I mean, the official stance is that they want a one-time deal, a major concession by North Korea to give up their nuclear program, and just then they will ease their sanctions. And that's not how usual negotiations work, right? I mean, one side gives a little, and then the other side does their share too. And North Korea exactly wants that. They want a simultaneous approach of step by step. And in the end, I think, there must be a compromise. I mean, there's no other way around it. And to be honest, I think the South Korean government actually is most committed in that peace process. I think the people here are suffering from the status quo, from the situation. North Korea, of course, we know that leader Kim Jong-un, he's more concerned about the economic well-being of his people because he made more promises that there won't be any more famines and there will be like an economic increase. But the regime security is always first priority. So, I mean, they know that from China they will get some kind of aid. There will be some economic collaboration. And yeah, I think as long as the North Korean state is not squeezed right to the edge, they feel that regime security is much more prioritized compared to economic development.
Right. And Mr. Bruce, the way that Kim Jong-un went ahead and tested these missiles, he knew what was at risk. Do you think it would be in his favor that this diplomatic process that is going on with the U.S. would come to a complete halt?
He was willing to test the waters. This is not 2017 in the sense that the testing at that time was much more frequent, whether it was a nuclear test or a test of a ballistic missile. This is the resumption of testing, the first of which we've seen since the fall of 2017. So I think it's definitely safe to say he's testing the waters and he's trying to encourage the United States to shift its position amid this current stalemate and as far as what both sides want to achieve. Kim Jong-un never explicitly said that he wasn't going to test any kinds of missiles or rockets. He's never said that he's going to break down his conventional weaponry. And it seems the United States, at least based on what we've heard from President Trump and Pompeo, are a bit unclear about what could and could not be tested. So it's frankly not a surprise that Kim maybe is shifting in this direction. We don't know exactly what was tested, I should add as well. Based on some photos released by state media, as well as analysis, it does appear to be a short-range ballistic missile, but nothing larger perhaps from the analysis. That still should raise concern for the United States, though they haven't overtly expressed that at the time, because a missile like that can strike U.S. forces within the region, as well as targeting the massive, dense urban population of Seoul. But we heard President Trump say he thinks Kim's still with him on this. They're going to continue working to find an agreement. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo didn't outright condemn the test, but said it wasn't an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, one with a range North Korea claims can strike the mainland United States, which is interesting in itself because by saying that North Korea didn't break down the framework by testing an ICBM, Pompeo is in some ways suggesting that it's okay if North Korea tests smaller missiles or rockets as long as it's not an ICBM.
Right, which is, again, a problem because the U.S. also has allies there in the region where the short-range missiles could effectively threaten their being, like, for example, Japan. Now, Mr. Fabian, let me come to you here. Maybe the precedent hasn't been set. Could it be a possibility that Kim Jong-un doesn't have the confidence in the U.S. for pulling through such a deal where it would have to sort of denuclearize or dismantle its nuclear warheads when it's really not seen U.S. Pay its part? For example, in the Iran deal, where it essentially backed off, even though the International Atomic Energy Agency had enough evidence to prove that Iran was complying.
Yeah, I think that the Iran deal is, for example, good justification for the hardliners in Pyongyang to not trust the U.S. Another example would be also Libya. I mean, Gaddafi, who gave up his program and who then later was killed and his regime was changed. I mean, I think those two states, I mean, historically they've been like they distrust each other like for the last 70 years. It's the Korean War was a really bloody war, and North Korea was flat out bombed. And this kind of image of an enemy, the U.S. imperial enemy, that's still kept alive very well.
And it's still very real. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. Mr. Bruce, I want your closing remarks also on the same question. Do you think that could play a role in deterring or not giving the confidence to Kim Jong-un to follow through?
Sure, I would agree with Fabian on that. That would reinforce the hardliners' position. Definitely, I think historically the United States has taken a policy very similar. Concurrent administrations have tried time and time again to encourage North Korea with both carrot and then sticks, promising aid, promising different forms of development, only to pull back when there was weapons testing. I don't think we're shifting from that paradigm too much at this point, despite what President Trump claims. So ultimately, we may be on a track to what we saw before, a prolonged stalemate, continued development in North Korea of its nuclear weapons program. All
right. Thank you so much there, Mr. Bruce, Fabian, for your input and your time. And we've unfortunately come to the end of the program. But till then, you can always watch clips of the program or the whole show on our YouTube channel, and also catch clips on our Twitter on Indus.News. Till then, and next time, goodbye.